Mosheim, in his book, The Ecclesiastical History, chapter 4, pages 2 to 3, if you look it up, wrote about another concept that was absolutely horrible. He wrote, "It was general throughout the church that it was an act of virtue to deceive and lie, when by that means the interests of the church might be promoted. Needless to say, sins other than those of falsehood and deceit were justified when committed in the supposed interests of the advancement of the church. And crime of any kind was condoned under the corrupt excuse that the end justifies the means." How many times have we seen where people under the guise of religion have committed gross sins and pretended as though it didn't matter? Many of the fables and fictitious stories relating to the lives of Christ and the apostles, as in the Gnostic writings, and also the phony accounts of holy visitations and amazing miracles, written in the early and not so far away centuries today, can be traced back to the teaching that lies are acceptable unto God if they are done in a cause that someone is willing to claim is good. Both Jews and pagans were accustomed to a vast variety of showy ceremonies in their religious service. They considered this display of wealth and of ceremony to be a critical part of all religion. And many former pagans and even Jews were disappointed with the simplicity of the Christian worship, which had no fancy ceremonies that made any such display. The bishops particularly wanted to remove that criticism, and they did it by increasing the number of worship services and by adding to the ceremonies, adding spectacular clothing for the priest to wear, scarlet, gold, furs, all kinds of things, building altars covered with gold for the priest to stand behind, and making carvings of a crucified man behind the altar for people to look at to impress the masses. The rulers of the church adopted, therefore, external ceremonies that of the type the pagans had, that they might captivate the senses of the vulgar and be able to refute the reproaches of their adversaries, according to the historian. A note added to these writings of Dr. Mosheim by the English language translator of Mosheim's book, which was originally in German, wrote as follows: "A remarkable passage in the life of Gregory, who was a bishop surnamed Thaumaturgus, which means the wonder worker, will illustrate the point to which some of these bishops descended, fell, corrupted themselves. When Gregory perceived, I'll just switch some of the complicated words for easier words. When Gregory saw that the ignorant multitude, members of the church, persisted with some of their idolatry on account of the pleasures and sexual gratifications which they enjoyed at the pagan festivals, he granted the members of the Church of Christ his permission to indulge themselves in the same kind of pleasures in celebrating in the holy days of the holy martyrs, hoping that in the process of time they would return of their own free will to a more virtuous and regular course of life." Now, what that means in pure, simple English, because you wouldn't necessarily understand everything that was involved with the pagan worship, was that Gregory said to the Christians that they could dance, sport, which meant engage in open to the public sexual acts, and have fabulous feasts on the tombs of the martyrs on the days of their individual martyrs' festivals, and to do everything in drunken orgies and whatever the pagans were used to doing in their temples during the feasts, they could do at the martyrs' graves. Gregory was the bishop of New Caesarea, a man of enormous influence in the early church. His approval of these corrupt activities during these ceremonies, patterned after pagan rites, was probably very popular with the former pagans and must have made the sincere Christians wonder what had happened to the true church of Jesus they had believed in. Mosheim wrote about the way the worship had been completely corrupted in just 100 to 150 years after the birth of the Savior. He wrote, this is Dr. Mosheim, "There is no institution so pure and excellent that the corruption and folly of man will not in time alter for the worse, and load with additions foreign to its nature and original design. Such in a particular manner was the fate of Christianity. In this century, many unnecessary rites and ceremonies were added to the Christian worship, the introduction of which was extremely offensive to wise and good men. These changes, while they destroyed the beautiful simplicity of the gospel, were naturally pleasing to the gross multitude who are more delighted with the pomp and splendor of external institutions than with the native charms of rational and solid piety," which means sincere spirituality, "and who generally give little attention to any objects but those which strike their outward senses." In other words, the people who were, many of the people were more impressed by the great churches, by the gold, by the fabulous robes the bishops wore, by the gold cups that had the wine, and all of the outward things, instead of the doctrine, instead of the honesty, instead of the purity, instead of the integrity of the worship. The bishops increased the number of worship services and ceremonies and sought to make them more impressive by way of accommodation. This is Mosheim again, by way of accommodation to the infirmities and prejudices of both Jews and heathens. In like manner, Mosheim continues, the comparison of the Christian oblation, which is the offer of worshiping the bread and the wine, with the Jewish victim and sacrifice, produced a large number of unnecessary rites in the Catholic Church and was the occasion of introducing the erroneous notion of the Eucharist, which represents it as though it was a real sacrifice of Jesus and was not in reality what Jesus had said it was, a sacred commemoration of this great offering of the Savior that was once made upon the cross for the sins of mortals. In the 4th century, we find that the church was still hopelessly committed to blind and dumb superstition. There had been no reformation, no going back to the original. The normal reverence with which the remains of early martyrs had been honored deteriorated into an excessive degree of worship of supposedly holy body parts of the saints. Pilgrimages by hundreds and thousands of people every year to the tombs of martyrs or to churches that had parts of martyrs' bodies became common as an outward form of religious devotion, which the church encouraged to a great degree. And the ashes of martyrs, as well as dust and earth and holy water brought from places said to have been made holy by some uncommon occurrence, all of these things, the dirt, the dust, the water, were sold as guaranteed remedies against disease and as means of protection against being invaded by evil spirits. This is the mockery to which the worship of Jesus Christ had descended because of the corruption of phony, unspiritual men.